Imagine, if you will, a disease so deadly to the community that anyone who has it has to be cast out and kept at least 6 feet away from other people. Further, in fact, if there happens to be a breeze, where they have to cover their mouths, where anything that they touch has to be washed and avoided for a certain period of time afterwards until the rules say that it's okay to touch it again. Where if you are even suspected of having it, the slightest possibility, you have to be separated from everyone, kept in your house, tested, and wait for 14 days. Where if anyone comes into contact with you, they themselves have to wash and be separate from others for a period of time. I am not talking about COVID-19. I'm talking about leprosy because these are precisely the rules given for leprosy in the book of Leviticus and further explained in Jewish tradition. Of course, there are some other things involved. What's the point of all of that? In fact, Leviticus goes on for 2 of the longest chapters in the Bible about all of it, giving a great deal of detail in procedures, very complicated procedures for even simply bringing a person back into the community. The person has to be checked by the priest, shaved, make sure that there's not any marks on the body. They can come into the community, but they have to stay separate from everyone for a week, and then they have to shave and wash again and be checked again. And both of these times they have to go through complicated rites. First of all, what is the point of the exclusion and very careful washings? The point is to keep the community safe from contamination, according to the rules that God gave, because a merely human understanding of disease at that time was very limited. God had a better idea of things and is fairly rational. And what was the purpose of all of the complicated rites for welcoming a person back into the community, or the particular rites for checking on someone who might have leprosy? The point was so that everybody knew perfectly well, we don't have to worry about this person anymore. It's safe, we're good, they know it, and we know it. And it's all perfectly clear. In terms of even not just that, but simply material affairs, how we deal with a disease, this gives us some example to work on. Our approach needs to be based on reasonable principles, and it needs to be geared at 2 things. 1, keeping the community safe, and 2, making sure that everybody's clear about what's going on. And that clarity demands that we have rational principles to work upon. In the best understanding of things, that it would be the idea of following the science. Although, we have to note there that science only tells us how we can do stuff. It can't tell us why. And to that end, the other necessary thing is that the community needs to have a common understanding of what the goal is. In the case of leprosy, it was recognized that they were dealing with a disease so infectious that they had to make sure that that infection did not spread because it would have disastrous results. I think, as an aside, this isn't the main point of the homily. I think there's been a lot of confusion and argument and frustration over how to deal with COVID-19 because we haven't talked about the most essential principle that we have to have a common understanding of to even begin dealing with it. Namely, how much death do we think is acceptable? We're not even willing to talk about that question, which is a problem, because that is the question. Our goal can never be, we must prevent all infection, or we must prevent all death from a disease. That goal is absolutely irrational. And I hope we would know that. But here's the problem. We're not discussing this as a society, because once we've established that, what we have to establish is, okay, what level of death is acceptable? Because we're not willing to talk about it, the way that things have gone up till this point is people butting heads up against each other, and the solution being come to mainly because of increased weariness of dealing with everything, and people just saying, oh, I don't care anymore. Well, that's not a good way of going about that. But I think part of the reason that people aren't willing to have that conversation is because they know deep down that there are some widely differing views about what the correct answer to that question is. And that's a place where subsidiarity, breaking things down to local community levels, is important. Because while worldwide efforts at developing techniques for dealing with disease are important and necessary, we need to put our heads together. When we start trying to say, well, everybody has to follow the same rules, that is going to cause a lot of problems. The community must have a common understanding. And you're never going to get the whole world to have a common understanding. I apologize, that was a long aside. But then where does that lead us? Well, based on the description that I gave, this presents a sort of funny situation for us. Those are the rules that apply to lepers. What does that mean? Every single one of us is a leper. There is no society to enter back into. The society itself is composed of lepers. We are experiencing the exclusion involved by that. But I don't want to talk more about disease, because these principles apply to how society runs and how the spiritual life runs. And that is the main point that I mean to make here. First, as far as society runs, I think a mistake that we make as American society is that we try to believe, we in fact have this very strong, irrational belief that all exclusion must be excluded. But that's not true or rational. Because there are certain ideas and behaviors which can go so far as to actually begin to destroy society. And our procedures and our behavior need to be geared towards dealing with that issue. And so on that point, when we talk about cancel culture, the advocates of cancel culture have a point. You can have ideas that are so different and so opposed to one another that they are in fact incapable of coexisting. Once you get to that point, and once you've moved past the point where there's really any more fruitful argument, the only solution is separation, which is an unfortunate thing. But we also have this irrational idea as a society that separation over differences is completely inadmissible. That's also false. That's why there are so many different communities in this world, and they cannot all be simply integrated. If you're going to have a single society, there can only be so broad a window of acceptable opinions. But here's where the problem comes in. You see, and I think part of the problem that we recognize in the so-called cancel culture is that it goes too far. It tries not only to silence a person or to restrain any actions, but it does it simply on the basis of feeling offended, or it does so simply because of who a person is, rather than the choices they make or the ideas that they hold. And I mention this because this is something that we would learn again from what is there for the rules for leprosy. You have to be sure that it will destroy the community. Communities have a certain level of durability. So we can't base it simply on feelings. In fact, it needs to be a rational principle, which means exclusion can never be based on who a person is. It can only be based on choices and ideas, rational principles. And those choices and ideas need to be so destructive to society that it warrants such a limit. Because we as a society refuse to believe that any sort of exclusion is admitted, we ignore this principle, which means that we come up with facsimiles of exclusion. We call it by other names. We try to ignore what it really is. We call it free market forces, or we call it hate speech, or whatever you might call it. It's still exclusion, but we refuse to see exclusion. We refuse to believe in it. And so what ends up happening is that more people end up being excluded from society in different kinds of ways, not necessarily being separated from it, but being denied things that are really necessary for living a human life. All because we refuse to acknowledge that there are some things that are incompatible with society. And so, people that find themselves excluded in different ways based off of not rational principles, but how they feel, they really take on this feeling of exclusion, which all of us have had a taste of because we're all lepers. And so they join together. And they object justly because they see that it's not based on any rational principle. And so you have different identities which are joined together based on the fact that they feel excluded. And this is a difficulty. This is a problem. Jesus points out a better way for us. Because all of those identities, the source of identity politics, is still based on the idea of harping on that idea of exclusion, which creates bitterness in the heart and ultimately is destructive for society. Jesus goes about in a way meant to bring people back in. Jesus, first of all, he touches this man, which according to the law he probably shouldn't have done, but he was God, so he can do that. Which that touch was enough to make this person feel loved and cared for. And then he said to the man, show yourself to the priest, so that the community is on board with this and everything is clear. Now, the man didn't obey, but what was pointed at there is a means of inclusion. Now, this becomes clearer when we see the method by which Jesus died. Because the law said, cursed is anyone that hangs upon a tree, as Jesus was crucified. And as St. Paul says, Jesus became a curse for us. He was counted a curse for the sake of, well, most of us are descended from Gentiles who were outside the community of Israel. Jesus' exclusion became the means for including all of us into society. And that is the mission of the church through history, bringing people into the life of God, taking that sense of exclusion on irrational principles and saying, here's the truth, here's reason, only that can exclude you. And so that brings us to the final point. The tradition of the church is, for the most part, only looked at the teachings on leprosy in terms of sin. Not that leprosy was ever sin, but the rules put in place for leprosy were meant to be a symbol of how we deal with sin. And so, looking at first, sin is a disease which is destructive to society. This should be clear enough. When we sin against one another, we harm one another. When the sin grows large enough and significant enough, it is the destruction of charity, which means mortal sin. That action is incompatible with loving God and loving neighbor, and we become spiritually dead. So here's the connection. Our venial sins, those sins which are not totally incompatible with loving God and loving neighbor, are like our coming into contact with leprosy. We do need to be cleansed, but it doesn't cast us out, and we're back in just like that. All we have to do is say that we're sorry, to have some level of devotion to seek God's grace. Mortal sin is like the case of the person who has the distinct symptoms of the disease, and so there has to be a testing. And we see this in the separation of the person for 14 days. Now, we don't follow a separation of 14 days for mortal sin, but what we're looking at there is, okay, there has been a serious offense against charity, either against love of God or love of neighbor. And it can be very destructive to the community because it breaks apart the bonds of life. And so the person has to show themselves to the priest, the sacrament of penance, in order to be reintegrated fully into the life of God and of the community, to ensure that that person in the community is not lost to divine life. But finally, we see in the full-blown taking on of the disease of leprosy a person who has embraced sin in their life, who have made it the principle that they work on, practically speaking. That is very destructive to the community, and by tradition would have been the basis of excommunication, although for the most part people just exclude themselves now. The goal is still always that they might come back to God, but that's in God's hands. We need to pray that such people would have an encounter like the leper with Jesus, because God does want to make all clean, but they must ask for it. And so let us pray for the health of our community. Let us try to root out our sins, to be clean before God by His grace. We're entering Lent here, so it's a time for us to return to the sacrament of penance, to check with the priest, to make sure that everything is all right, that we're still growing, that we're still being a source of love, that we are included and excluding according to rational principles and not according to our whims. And though we may be lepers, God will heal us. Praise be Jesus Christ.